Welcome to this session of this one other session of the PMR Perspectives series. The topic of today is the development of domestic crediting systems, and we're going through the presentation of the guide that was recently elaborated by the World Bank on advice and guidance on how to develop domestic crediting systems and what the role they can play in domestic climate policy. My name is Pedro Martins Barata. I was one of the team members on the development of the guide. I'm happy to serve as moderator for this discussion. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. To note that microphones will be muted for the duration of this event. And if you cannot hear the speakers, you have to select audio settings, usually down in the left-hand corner of your screen, and choose your preferred audio output because you may be with the wrong audio settings. We won't have a chat option through the panel presentations, but we welcome that you pose your questions to the panelists by selecting the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand for view on the PMR website. The URL for that website will be coming up at the end. And once the event concludes, you'll leave the session, or at any time you want to leave it, hopefully when the event concludes, you will leave the session by pressing the red button on your right-hand corner, in the lower right-hand corner, that quite appropriately is called Leave. Just a quick run through the format of what we're going to go through. Following my welcome, we'll have a first opening remarks by Chandra Sinha from the World Bank's team. He serves as a senior climate change advisor. Following that, it will be my pleasure to introduce Marisa Santikard, who will give us a presentation on exactly the topic of what we have on our hands, the development of crediting systems, and the recently published carbon crediting guide. And then after that, we will go into a panel discussion with several of our panelists having been involved or currently being involved in the development of or the run of carbon pricing schemes. And we will have a discussion on what the role of carbon crediting schemes are in assisting different emissions trading and other regimes around the world. So with this, let me break to Chandra Sinha. Thank you very much. And Chandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro, and hello and welcome to everyone in this third webinar where we will be looking at the decade-long experience of the Partnership for Market Readiness, or the PMR, working with more than 20 countries, trying to look at the options for carbon pricing, looking at technical design issues, looking at ways to convene broad set of stakeholders in order to look at ways by which countries can move forward in implementing their climate goals or their climate policies in a most cost-effective manner and in ways that ambition can be raised. And those of you who followed the discussion have noted the role of the PMR in building the consensus, understanding, and approaches towards greater use of carbon pricing instruments. And this is the third in the series of the workshops, webinars, virtual events. We would have loved the opportunity, like all of you probably on these calls to have done this in person, to have interacted more, learned much more through that process. But we are where we are, and hopefully very soon, we will be able to get together. But the previous webinars have covered basically the emission trading system and the carbon taxes. And this third webinar, as Pedro introduced, will cover crediting mechanisms, the guide to domestic crediting mechanisms. Uh, the crediting mechanisms have received a lot of attention of late, primarily as momentum builds towards the broader global stakeholder community, recognizing the challenge of climate change and focusing on moving towards a net zero world by 2050. Following the news reports, you would have noted that nearly 30 countries, over 1,500 largest, some of them largest corporate entities committing to net zero targets by 2050. And, the role of crediting mechanism in that term net zero, where you try to compensate for any residual emissions within your boundaries, where a lot of the attention has been, a lot of the concern has been, a lot of the issues have focused around. And certainly we expect that civil society, concerned stakeholders would look and give much greater scrutiny to the way these crediting instruments are designed, or crediting mechanisms are designed. And that's where I think the significance of what you will hear today will become much more apparent. Clear, transparent, stepwise, systematic approach to design of creating domestic crediting instruments, which then can meet a range of requirements, I hope, is what you will take away from here, particularly as the interest of the private sector, the voluntary markets begin to scale up. And again, if you've been following the discussion around the task force on scaling up voluntary carbon markets, you'll see that it is expected to grow in orders of magnitude. It's not just one or two multiples, but orders of magnitude in order to meet the ambition that is required to address the climate challenge. So, what is equally important is the focus of this this guidebook is on the domestic uses of these crediting mechanisms, and these will become under increasing focus, I understand or believe, as more and more countries move forward with implementation of their own carbon pricing instruments. And the biggest one which would be rolled out, which has been rolled out and which will begin to see much more interest, is that of the emission trading system in China, where the use of crediting carbon credits or credits will be allowed under the compliance requirements under the Chinese ETS. And therefore, the focus of a lot of the discussion and the guidebook is on this part of it. How do you design crediting mechanisms for domestic uses? All of this, as I indicated, is built on a long experience, and you'll hear from the panel on the experiences in many of these countries. As those of you who followed PMR will recognize, nearly a third of the support, a third of the countries supported through the PMR focused on creating mechanisms. It's a non-exhaustive list, but certainly Costa Rica, Vietnam, Peru focused on it in their PMR work. In the case of Jordan, the support was for urban creating or citywide creating instruments. A lot of the work was done as a part of this, and certainly you will hear from the panel today on the experiences from South Africa, from jurisdictions like Australia, Quebec, Chile, in the panel, and it'll be interesting to relate that to the systematic approach that has been put in the guidebook. And certainly, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Pedro and the whole team to put together this very, very systematic approach to design of domestic crediting mechanisms, and certainly look forward to listening to the views of the panel following the presentation that Marisa will make. So thank you, welcome, and I hope we get to see each other sometime soon to continue the dialogue on carbon pricing instruments. So back to you, Pedro.
Thank you, Chandra. And just to say, it was to acknowledge your thanks to myself and on behalf of the consultant team. It's been a pleasure doing this work. And I'll also echo some of the comments you've made on the context in which we are currently living in terms of the renewed interest of carbon crediting or on carbon crediting, whether it's from Article 6 discussions, the voluntary market, or simply just generically the notion that we need to do more in terms of climate change, and that carbon crediting is one of the instruments that perhaps has not been as used and not as considered so far as much as it ought to be. And to that end, the reason, I think, and the timeliness for this carbon crediting guide, of which we are going to learn more from Marisa Santikaran. She's with the World Bank climate change team for quite a while. Previous to that, she worked in Germany and I'm told Thailand as well on carbon pricing generically. And she has a master's degree in public policy from the Hertie School of Government and a BA LLB from University of Melbourne. But now, Marisa, over to you and a presentation of our carbon crediting guide.
Thanks, Pedro. And I'll just wait for the slides to come up. Yeah, so good morning, everybody. And like Pedro was saying, I will be going through some of the key messages from the crediting guide to designing and implementing domestic carbon crediting mechanisms. This is part of a series of guides that the Partnership for Market Readiness has produced that really goes into some of the steps and details on how you can design and roll out certain carbon pricing instruments, building on a lot of the experience that we have through the PMR partnership. And this is not only through working with developing countries who are designing and rolling out those instruments, but also through the donors and technical partners who have that experience and are going through that process of operating and evolving their carbon pricing instruments. Last week, we had the launch of our carbon pricing assessment guide, as well as the revised emissions trading system handbook. And we also have the carbon tax guide as well. Before I start, I also just wanted to give a shout out, sort of echoing what Chandra had said, that it's, thank you to the World Bank team that produced this report, but also particularly to get to see carbon limits, the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, INFRAS, and Stockholm Environment Institute. I see some of the people like Janet and Randall are on the call today. Also thanks to Blue Source and for putting this guide together. So if we can go to the next slide. The guide essentially is broken down into 3 components. The first one, most obviously, getting started, has a look at the jurisdictional context. And then there's a section that goes through some of the main components and design elements of crediting mechanisms. These will be things like your methodologies and figuring out scope, before concluding with some issues about governance and institutional frameworks. So this touches on topics like the use of auditors and other governance and supporting frameworks, things like registries and so forth. If you could go to the next slide, please. So before we start, maybe just a quick walkthrough of what is crediting. So crediting is the process of issuing emissions reduction or removal units for activities that have been certified and can be quantified. What essentially is the critical component here is thinking about what would occur absent this project. So the amount of units that are issued is compared to a baseline counterfactual scenario, as well as to what would happen if the crediting mechanism did not exist. And crediting mechanisms can happen on a variety of scales. We also have projects going on at the World Bank that look at, for instance, how crediting can work on a sector level. But the focus of this guide is confined to the project and programmatic level. If you can go to the next slide, please. In terms of policy objectives, so why, for instance, you may want to have a carbon crediting mechanism, and my apologies for the Wi-Fi connection here. I think first and foremost, it's a climate policy tool. So policymakers can use it to reduce their emissions and design it as part of their broader mitigation and adaptation strategies to achieve climate targets. It can also be a good way of mobilizing carbon finance, and it can also provide a number of development benefits alongside those climate goals. And so this could be things like benefits to indigenous communities or improving biodiversity. And depending on those development benefit crediting mechanism in order to target and generate desirable. And the guide also goes through a number of ways in which you can design your crediting mechanism to achieve that, whether it's through things like eligibility rules or methodologies. And finally, because we're talking about carbon pricing as well, crediting is also a way in which policymakers can use it to reduce compliance costs for those regulated entities that are under an emissions trading system or a carbon tax. And that's probably something that you will hear from some of our panelists today. By linking it to that ETS or carbon tax, it's a way of extending the carbon price to those uncovered sectors. And as I was saying before, it gives a source of compliance flexibility to those companies. How does crediting actually fit into the policy mix? So I was talking before about how it can fit in relation to an emissions trading system and a carbon tax. And many emissions trading systems do allow regulated companies to submit a share of credits in order to reach their compliance obligations. And there are a couple of carbon taxes that allow this as well, like South Africa and Colombia. However, as you can kind of see from the diagram on this slide, policymakers should also be aware of other instruments already in the policy mix, and this can influence how you may decide the scope of your carbon crediting mechanism. If, for instance, there's an overlap in the scope of your crediting mechanism and an emissions trading system, that may, for instance, call into question the additionality of the crediting mechanism. And if you work in carbon pricing and crediting, additionality is probably a word that you're sick to death of hearing, but that's essentially looking at to what extent are those emissions reductions or removals driven by the crediting mechanism, or was it driven by something else? And if you have an overlap with other regulatory instruments or with your emissions trading system and carbon tax, that can be much harder to ascertain. And finally, another important point to note about crediting in the policy mix is that crediting cannot function by itself. And so before policymakers put a crediting mechanism in place, they need to do an assessment and make sure that there will be an external source of demand to meet the supply of credits generated. So the guide goes into a number of components about how you can develop your domestic crediting mechanism. And it also sets up three criteria, or sort of three things that you should bear in mind as you're designing your instrument. And these are low transaction costs, minimizing the administrative burden, and of course, high environmental integrity. And where you land across all three of these will probably depend on your jurisdictional context. Of course, you're going to need a certain level of environmental integrity in order to have trust and credibility in your crediting mechanism. But establishing additionality and baseline emissions can potentially add costs. not only in terms of the project developer side, but also for the government side. And so having an assessment of what level of environmental integrity is needed, and also looking at ways in which you can manage the costs, whether, for instance, it's through outsourcing certain functions or simplifying certain procedures, are also issues that we explore in the guide. Next slide, please. And so I'm not going to go over every single design element of the guide because otherwise we'll be here for days. But I will be touching on the carbon credit quality, governance, and also how you can build on other existing mechanisms. So the first issue is carbon credit quality. And you know, this is an issue that is also something that's been heavily discussed in the past year, also in the voluntary market. It's not only what role do you want your carbon crediting mechanism to play, but you know, what kind of credits are you generating from your carbon crediting mechanism? And there are a number of ways in which jurisdictions can address this issue of quality and ensuring that you only credit projects that are additional. Now, what you actually do will, again, probably depend on your jurisdictional context, but there are a number of suggestions that we outline in the guide and are probably also things that some of our panel members can talk about in more detail. And these include things like setting conservative business as usual baselines. And it also can include setting a number of additionality tests. So these can be things like your eligibility criteria. So you may want to say, for instance, in my crediting system, I'm only going to allow certain technologies, or I'm not going to allow certain projects, depending on your preferences. You know, these can be positive or negative lists. And most jurisdictions use a combination of these tests in order to assess additionality. My internet is just very unstable right now. So these can be things like whether or not your crediting activities are additional to what's required by regulation, whether or not it's something that would have been financially viable without your crediting mechanism. Jurisdictions should also ensure that they have safeguards against double counting. And robust monitoring and accounting provisions can be a really good way of protecting against this risk. And finally, the way in which you ensure vary depending on your project type. A particular issue that we look at in the guide, for instance, is the use of forestry credits and how you can ensure permanence. And these are, again, things that, you know, members of our panel, I'm thinking of, you know, Jane in particular from Australia can probably speak to, and ways in which you could set up buffer pools or discounting systems, for instance, to, you know, give some guarantee that the permanency of those emission removals from forestry or land use projects are secured to a certain extent. Next slide, please. And so we also look at a lot of governance issues, but the Partnership for Market Readiness has, of course, already published quite a lot of guidance on this. So rather than necessarily repeating all of the steps, we do point to additional work, for instance, that takes you through how to set up registries, how to deal with things like accrediting and verifying auditors as part of your MRV process. In addition, like any policy, stakeholder engagement is going to be really critical, not only in building support for the crediting mechanism, but also in getting some feedback as to how you're designing and implementing your mechanism in the first place. And finally, governments should also make sure that they do an assessment of any knowledge or technical gaps, both in the private sector and also within the government and, you know, regulatory bodies themselves, to see whether any programs or reports need to be put out in order to fill those gaps. Next slide, please. So now it sounds like a lot of work, and setting up your own domestic crediting mechanism can be quite a significant undertaking, not only in terms of financial resources, but also technical capacity. But there are also a number of existing crediting mechanisms out there that jurisdictions can draw on. And this has not only informed the practical examples that we give in the guide, but these can also be grouped into roughly 2 categories of how jurisdictions can maybe rely on what's already out there. And the first one is essentially, you can just, for instance, use those credits that are generated by other international mechanisms with or without certain criteria. And so if you look at jurisdictions like the Republic of Korea, for instance, they started off crediting CDM credits as part of their compliance obligations under the national carbon market with certain conditions, for instance, the geographic location. The other way in which you can use existing crediting mechanisms is by adapting or using certain components of the design. For instance, you could build on methodologies that have already been established, or you could also outsource certain functions rather than do them in-house. And this is something that California and Alberta, for instance, do with their registry functions. And over time, of course, this decision could change. In the beginning, for instance, if there is a real need for an immediate supply of credits, maybe it makes sense to just rely on credits generated by existing mechanisms under certain conditions. But over time, as you build your own capacity and you might be ready to start generating your own credits, maybe that's something that you move away from. Next slide, please. And so that basically brings me to the end of the presentation, and I'm going to hand over now to Pedro so that we can turn to the panel for a discussion on their experiences with crediting.
Thank you, Marisa. And so over now to the panel. We have an excellent panel with panel members coming from different jurisdictions across the world that have had experience or of some sort with carbon crediting, with domestic carbon crediting. So we're going to be hearing from the practitioners themselves. And the way we're going to run this panel is the panelists will each have a initial intervention of around 7 minutes, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A session. In this initial intervention, I'd like the panelists to focus their intervention on the role that carbon crediting is taken, and the difficulties and also the opportunities that they have seen in their practical experience in implementing carbon crediting. So first off on my list of speakers is Jane Wardlaw, General Manager in Australia's Clean Energy Regulator and responsible for overseeing registration and crediting under Australia's Emission Reduction Fund, and also responsible for the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, the Safeguard Mechanism, and the operation of the Australian National Registry of Emission Units. With this, I hand over to Jane. Jane, a little bit about your experience with the domestic crediting scheme under the ERF.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. So I guess a bit of background about the Clean Energy Regulator. I'll just start my clock because I know I've only got 7 minutes. So the Clean Energy Regulator, if we can just skip to the next slide, please. We're responsible for the Australian government's, some of their main climate change policies. There's the renewable energy target. It is a market-based mechanism that we're responsible for that's designed to encourage investment in renewable energy. It's not a true offset scheme. I think in the context of this conversation, it doesn't have the true additionality elements. So I guess I will leave that to one side for the purposes of this discussion. The National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, I'm slightly biased as it's sort of been my starting point into the Clean Energy Regulator, but it sets up, I guess, a framework for the reporting by Australia's largest emitters and users and producers of energy. And then that's leveraged to form a lot of the sort of policy for some of our other carbon pricing initiatives. So currently we've got the safeguard mechanism that requires big companies with large facilities to keep their emissions below baselines that are set by the Clean Energy Regulator. And then we have the Emissions Reduction Fund, which I think is sort of the most relevant part for today's discussion, which is our domestic offset sort of scheme where people can register projects that then report to the Clean Energy Regulator for any abatement that's achieved under those projects, and we issue them with the Australian Carbon Credit Unit or an ACCU, which can then be sort of either traded or used by the person that's actually generating that abatement. So if we go to the next slide, please. I guess I thought it would be, this is a very abridged history. I don't think it's any secret that in Australia, the climate debate has been quite political. And I guess the upside of that is we've experienced a few different policy settings that we've had to implement. So starting in 2007, we saw the introduction of the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting legislation. So that set out the framework for these large Australian companies to report in a consistent way on their emissions and their energy production and consumption. Interestingly, that legislation had bipartisan support. So I think it's been one of the less contested parts of our sort of policy settings. So in 2012 to 2014, we had a carbon price. So this is where any facilities that were large emitters had to purchase units to account for the emissions that they were producing on a yearly basis. And as I guess the counter to that, then you had the Carbon Farming Initiative, which was our offset scheme that allowed projects to be registered and claim abatement. Very much land-based was the focus of the Carbon Farming Initiative. Where we're at today, Carbon Farming Initiative projects transitioned across to the Emissions Reduction Fund, which again is now our mainstay. So this is where any projects that are registered claiming abatement for abatement or avoidance of emissions will be issued with ACCUs. Now, I think the interesting place that we're in now is currently the government is the largest demand source for those ACCUs. So the Commonwealth purchases units through a reverse auction process. And I think at the moment we make up at about 90% of demand for ACCUs. As I've mentioned before, there is the safeguard mechanism. And because that sets baselines for companies, they can purchase ACCUs to reduce their net emissions if they exceed those baselines. Because of the settings of the policy at the moment, the baselines are quite generous. It's not intended to actually make people reduce emissions. It's really intended to cap emissions at the moment. But where I think the really exciting space is for Australia at the moment is voluntary demand. So a lot of our policy settings at the moment are around facilitating voluntary demand. So while government contracts are still sort of 85, 90% or more of demand for ACCUs at the moment, we have actually seen a 60% increase in voluntary demand. So this is really being driven by companies' net zero commitments, so where they're actually surrendering ACCUs voluntarily to meet some of those commitments that they've made. So we're undergoing a number of initiatives, I guess, to kind of facilitate voluntary demand. And an example of this is where our contracts previously were fixed price and fixed delivery. So people signed up to sell their offset units back to the government at a fixed price according to a fixed schedule. They now actually have the option to not sell to the government and instead to sell into the secondary market. And what we're seeing is that's making up the majority of contracts that we enter into, which is, I think, really encouraging for us because we want to move out of being the main purchaser of units, and we're trying to sort of push that into the private sector, and we're certainly seeing that happening. So if we can go to the last slide. I think the lessons learnt, especially for the emissions reduction fund, offsets work very well for the land sector, but there's still a number of complicating factors, and I think that was alluded to in this speaker before. So it's really important to have checks and balances. We have what we call the ERAC, which is the Emissions Reductions Assurance Committee. It's an independent body that assesses the methods, which is basically the rule book that sets out how you can measure and claim your abatement. So that's independent from the people that are actually setting the policy, and they make recommendations to our minister, who then finally settles the method. Again, you have an independent regulator, which is where I work. So that sort of gives you that slight sort of separation of powers again. But the complication still with land-based systems is they are very variable. And this is where you need to have the ability to balance, I guess, integrity versus complexity. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we've been grappling with. So, you know, obviously land-based systems are very open to risk of reversal. So, you know, we have risk of reversal buffers. We've got sort of legislative ability to claw back where any abatement that's happened has been reversed. You know, you might have a bushfire, somebody might buy the land and then come in and cut down trees that have been planted. So we've got clawback mechanisms, plus we build in some buffers and conservatism into the actual calculations. But every single time, I guess, you add something like that, you're adding to the complexity. So the biggest challenge I think we've had is, as a voluntary scheme where you're trying to increase participation, the more complexity to get that integrity, the harder it is to encourage people to sign up. And then when they do sign up, to actually make it easy for them to claim the abatement and continue to participate in the scheme. And I guess the final point there is technology, we think, is probably the way of the future. So we're looking into all sorts of remote sensing technology, APIs, you know, what can we do to actually streamline people's experience when they're registering and claiming their abatement? And I will leave it there because I believe I'm out of time.
Thank you, Jane. That was excellent, and you did meet the time requirements. So thank you personally as a panel moderator. Before I go on and introduce the next speaker, I would just like to tell the audience that we do have a Q&A button. You will have a Q&A button, and we're listening in and waiting for your questions on any of the materials and presentations that are being made. So go ahead and do, by all means, write down your questions. So now next on our list is Jean-Yves Benoit. Jean-Yves Benoit is someone whom I have the pleasure to know for a number of years. And he's recently been, I think, made Director General of Carbon Regulation and Emissions Data at the Quebec Ministry of Environment. Basically, the go-to person in Quebec for anything to do with carbon markets, but also somebody who has been involved in many capacity building exercises, spreading the word, put it this way, on the role that carbon markets can play in developing your climate policy. So Jean-Yves, tell us about the experience, the particular experience of Quebec with carbon crediting schemes. Over to you.
Thank you, Pedro. I would like to thank the PMR for having me this morning with all of you. It is a pleasure to be here. Although it's always better to see each other face to face. I will briefly talk about our crediting mechanism. Would it be possible to move to the next slide, please? Thank you. In Quebec, we do have a cap and trade program in place. Our cap and trade does cover about 82% of our greenhouse gas emission. Basically, we cover transport fuels, industry, fuels used in buildings for heating purposes, electricity generation. Part of our emissions are not covered by our cap and trade program, basically agriculture, waste, and some subsectors of the transport, marine, and air. There is mitigation opportunities in both covered and non-covered sector of activity. We do have an ambitious mitigation goal. If we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to set each other ambitious mitigation goal. And in achieving those goals, we apply different principles. And I would say the first one is to avoid emitting greenhouse gas emissions. The second principle is to reduce as much as possible. And then, and I would say only then, think about compensation. Therefore, we choose to have the broadest scope possible for our cap and trade program in order to force mitigation to happen within our jurisdictions. Yes, we do have a crediting mechanism in place. It allows us to reduce compliance costs for covered entities. Can we move to the next slide, please? In designing our offset program or crediting mechanism, we've done it through the Western Climate Initiative partnership. It is very important for us, and as Marisa mentioned it, to have rigorous criteria. It needs to have very high environmental integrity in our system. Therefore, we make sure that our reductions are real, permanent, additional, verifiable. Verified is something very important. Transparency is key. And coming back to real and permanent, we do want something that is beyond business as usual. If we really want to curb our level of emission, reduce our level of emission, you need to take actions beyond business as usual scenario. There are many reasons why we chose to move forward with a domestic crediting mechanism. And to come back to Marisa's presentation, yes, it could be burdensome to put in place such a mechanism, but it has different benefits. The first one, as I mentioned, it does increase the pool of low-cost mitigation. Once you cover transport industry buildings, you start by doing the low-cost mitigation. As time goes by, mitigation or reduction becomes more and more expensive. There is some low-hanging fruit in non-covered sector of activities, and you want to access them. So therefore, your crediting mechanism is a good way to do so. I would put the cautious here. If you use crediting mechanism, we did limit the use of offset in our system. And this is an important feature because it kind of forces covered sectors to reduce to a certain level. So this is something to consider if you want to design your own crediting mechanism. It does have environmental and social co-benefit to reduce not only in covered sectors, but also in non-covered sectors. Crediting mechanism could be a way to change behavior. We see it as a way to support the deployment of new technology or the deployment of, I would say, new ways of doing things. Maybe two examples, biodigesters. We put in place some programs in order to support the development of biodigesters. It allows us to, instead of putting our waste into a landfill sites and emitting even more greenhouse gas emission, you can generate energy with that and reduce your consumption of fossil-based fuels. It is expensive. It is not a business as usual scenario. So therefore, we do have some programs to help put in place new biodigesters. And we are thinking of coming up with an offset protocol in order to give the small push it needs really to spur that new sector of activity in Quebec. Another example is the collection and destruction of ODS substances, gases used in freezers and cooling systems. At the moment, it is not allowed to emit them, but there's no regulation that forces destruction. So an offset system could be a way to promote change in the industry, and then it's going to slowly become business as usual scenario. Crediting system could also be used as a transition before regulation comes into effect. And this is something we are looking at, especially coming back to ODS substances. At the moment, we do have a protocol in place, but in time, once it becomes, I would say, business as usual, or once the industry is mature, we have all the collect system in place throughout our economy, then it can become a mandatory obligation to collect, destroy those ODS, which basically results in lower mitigation. Again, maybe just to complete here, the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Crediting is a way to doing it. But if we are to use crediting mechanism for compensation only, we will never achieve our mitigation goals. So we do see it as, I would say, a transition, and especially if we keep in mind 2050, where we want to become carbon neutral, it will not be possible for each of us to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by paying someone else to do it for us. So every sector of activities will need to contribute. Definitely, crediting mechanism is a very powerful, a very good tool to achieve that. I would say in the short, medium term. In the longer term, we're going to have to definitely move to mandatory mitigation. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Yves, and thank you for keeping to the time. Next on our speaker, and please do keep your questions coming in. Next on our speaker list is Carolina Urmeneta, who's, just as Jean-Yves was the go-to person apparently in Quebec for everything carbon, Carolina is the go-to person for everything climate in Chile. So she's the head of the Climate Change Office of the Chilean Ministry of Environment, and she's been leading for 3 years projects such as the Climate Change Framework Law or the update of the NDC, of the Chilean NDC, and the reform of the Chilean Green Tax. She holds a master's degree in sustainability sciences, a diploma in disaster risk management and climate change, and she's a civil engineer in biotechnology from the University of Chile. So Carolina, muchas gracias, and over to you, please.
Thank you, Pedro, and thanks for the organization of this series. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm going to speak about the designing of domestic crediting mechanism in Chile. And as you were saying, we are now in the Congress with our climate change project law or bill, and this bill established GHG emissions, of course, and a compensation system. And today I am also going to talk about our tax reform that is already a law since February of the last year, and it established a reform on the green tax and the compensation system. So if we could go to the next slide. Regarding the bill, we are given the Environment Ministry a new capacity, which is to develop greenhouse gas emission standards and the possibility to have emission reductions certificates in a really same way that it is established, for example, in Korea or in other countries as Colombia, and a greenhouse gas certification system. What is the objectives of this is, of course, to reduce GHG emissions, but to have compliance flexibility on the standards with mitigation projects that are cost effective. And this is one more instrument in order to achieve the sectoral goals that are going to be defined on our long-term climate strategy. So this is one instrument to help in order to go for our mitigations goals, that is to be carbon neutral on 2050, which is also established in this bill. If we go to the next slide, this is what we hope to have, okay, when this bill becomes a law, which is with urgency in the Congress. So we are discussing this with a lot of meetings with the Congress. But we also have, since 2017, a green task in Chile. Okay, this task is for stationary sources, and on the year 2019, we did a modification, which is already a law. If we go to the next slide, that this is the law, you could see there, 21,210, which established a green task reform and a compensation system, which is a really innovation for Chile, because we didn't have this in our domestic market. And what this modification established was that we put an emission threshold of 25,000 of tons of CO2 per year. This will affect fixed source, and it is for an estimate of 37 million tons, which is 33% of our total GHG emission at national level. So it is an important thing. It is 1/3 of the total of our emission that will be affected by this tax. And we establish the possibility to have a local compensation mechanism with offsets. This will start in 2023. So we are working on this. We are looking the mechanism, as I was saying, of Colombia, Korea, and other experience, of course, Canada, etc., in order to have a mechanism that, of course, goes for projects that are additionals, measurables, verifiable, permanent, and transparent. And we don't want to invent the wheel, because we know that, of course, we have markets and we have standards that are working with this. And that is why we are developing now the rules for this compensation mechanism. And we are using what we already know, and we want to recognize standards and the advance that we have at an international level in order to develop this domestic mechanism here in Chile. It will start in 2023, but our goal is to have these rules for open comments during this first semester of 2021 or the beginning of the second, in order to have the tools already approved and in a final version for 2022 for the private sector, in order for them to know what we are going to accept as this compensation mechanism, and they could prepare to use it for 2023 when this will start as the law is established. So that is what we are working on our domestic mechanism now in Chile.
Thank you, Carolina. And it's quite interesting to see, just from the examples that we've had now, the different uses that carbon crediting schemes at domestic level can have, and different frameworks. Jean-Yves was very much coming at it from the emissions trading side, but clearly in Chile it's being used in a quite different context as support to the compliance with a green tax or carbon tax. And I believe that is fairly along the same lines as in South Africa, where Memory Machingambi, our next speaker, comes from. She's a senior economist of environmental and fuel taxes at the South African National Treasury, and she's been deeply involved in the design and rollout of the national carbon tax and crediting mechanism. And prior to this work, she was a postdoc researcher at the University of Pretoria and a senior lecturer at the University of Western Cape. She's a PhD in natural resource and environmental economics from Texas A&M University. Again, keep having these, keep sending us questions throughout, but in the meantime, Memory, you have the floor. Tell us about South Africa.
Thanks, Pedro. So, may I please have the next slide? I'm just going to give a brief background. So our carbon offset scheme is embedded within our carbon tax. We're one of the countries that allow our taxpayers to reduce their taxable amount through submitting credits. So it is part of the carbon tax, I guess, as an instrument, is part of a suite of measures that South Africa is implementing for our NDC. Next slide, please. So I guess to give context to the offsets, this is our greenhouse gas inventory from 2015, and it's based on the IPCC code system. So the carbon tax applies to energy as mostly from fuel combustion, fugitive emissions, and industrial processes. So category 1 and 2 are covered by the tax, but category 3 and 4, which is the agriculture, forest, and other land use, and the waste sectors are not covered within the carbon tax. So for us to encourage gas mitigation in those sectors that are not covered by the tax, we implemented this carbon offset scheme so that companies can actually develop projects in those sectors that are not covered by the tax. And it also helps us with accounting for our emissions. Next slide, please. So the structure of our tax, it mimics an emissions trading scheme because when it was muted, there were no taxes around the world. So we're looking at emissions trading schemes, and we're trying to mimic the allocation, the free allocations that happen in an emissions trading scheme. So you find that we have basic tax-free allowances where everyone gets a 60% basic tax-free allowance. And our offsets, we allow the fuel combustion emissions to offset up to 10% of their emissions as offsets, and the industrial and fugitive emissions can only offset up to 5%. So like Quebec, we have a limit for us just to incentivize actual mitigation in the company's activities. So next slide, please. I guess this is just giving the objectives for the offsets. And I think I spoke to them that it's a flexibility mechanism for the taxpayers to mitigate in other projects that probably be at a lower cost than within their own activities. And it also to incentivize mitigation in sectors that are not covered by the tax. Next slide, please. So in terms of our carbon offsetting, I think from Marisa's slide, we are utilizing, we have full reliance on the international offsets. So the CDM, VCS, and gold standards projects that were developed in South Africa, so we've got a geographical scope about it, can be used for offsetting activities. And we've also, through the PMR, developed a local standard framework that we're going to consult on, because when we did our carbon sinks study as a country, we discovered we've got mitigation potential in the Afolu and other project activities that are not covered well by these international activities I spoke about. And the other objective, I guess, in terms of us having the domestic offset standard is also we're a country with a with a high level of inequality, and jobs is a major issue. So we're trying to incentivize mitigation activities that will happen at the local level that will create employment opportunities. And so I guess the criteria for the offsets is if you're developing the projects now, they have to be outside of the taxable activities, and they can only be in South Africa. But we're looking at, when we design the phase 2, we might consider going into the SADC region. And the offsets, so there was an issue, I guess, of offsets that were already in the pipeline that were developed under CDM, VCS and all. And because we're not a least developed country, we can't now sell them into the EU. We could only sell them to end of 2012. So for the first phase, for us to ensure there was market liquidity, we've allowed those offset projects, even if they were developed under taxable activities. We've got, we allowed them to be used for the first phase because it's a transitioning phase. But after this, we cannot allow offset projects in projects that were developed that are taxable. Next slide, please. So this is just to give a snapshot in terms of what kind of projects we're looking at. So we allow energy efficiency, but we also have an energy efficiency tax incentive. So to make sure people are not double dipping from the government incentives, you can only do energy efficiency as offset projects if they do not claim the tax incentive. And also we have, in terms of waste, our municipalities, we're trying to develop those so that they can do the waste to energy projects. And then the agriculture, forest, and land use, these are just examples of projects that could be developed as offsets. Next slide, please. So in terms of also maximizing the systems we already have in the country, the current carbon offset administrator is the designated national authority under the UNFCCC. So they have skills, they've been doing the CDM, I guess applying letters of approval and all. So they are the ones that are actually administering the current system. And our taxpayers actually use that system to get an offset certificate, and then they surrender it to the tax authority. But once utilized, it is, once it's utilized, we then sort of retire the credits. They can no longer be used anywhere else. So that's just a snapshot from South Africa. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Memory, for that snapshot. That was quite a comprehensive presentation. We now go into the Q&A session, and let me also just, in the meantime, warn you, put it this way, to the fact that at the end of the presentation and during our closing session, we will have the output of a graphic illustrator of our conversation. I failed to mention that at the introduction. So we have a set of questions pretty much to every speaker, and perhaps by the order of the speakers themselves. So first of all, to Jean-Yves, and essentially there's a generic question that I will ask of all of you, which is, how do you deal with the issue of carbon neutrality claims on behalf of corporations? Can companies use carbon credits that are generated by your domestic crediting system to claim, for example, carbon neutrality, either for themselves or for their products? And if so, are these claims regulated somehow? So that's the generic question to all of you. Specifically to Jean-Yves, the question is, you mentioned this sort of hierarchy of mitigation, going from avoiding, reducing, and then only for those emissions that you can't reduce, then compensating. I understand that is in some shape already written into some regulation. So on both the generic and the specific question to you, Jean-Yves, please go ahead.
On your, well, let's go with your second questions. The list of the principles are not in a legislation in Quebec, but they are published in our new climate action plan called the Plan for Green Economy. I put the link in the Q&A section. If you go into answered one, for those who wants to see it, it is on page 32. Maybe just a small precision. Yes, the first thing is to avoid emitting greenhouse gas emission. The second one is to reduce as much as possible. Then we kind of put sequestration as well. So it goes with reduction, and then only then you can look at compensation. In terms of allowing our domestic credit to be used for carbon neutrality or to be bought very at large, first thing everyone has to know, someone needs to be registered in our cap and trade program to be able to buy compliance instrument. Not only covered entities can register, but everyone can register through our system. And we do allow for someone to request basically the retirement of either emission credit or even emission unit that are under our system. So I would say yes, if someone wants to become carbon neutral using our credit or our compliance instrument, it is possible. Although just to, even though we're linked with California, we still have somehow a small system. And in order to prevent someone from removing too many compliance instruments, therefore affecting the well-being of the system, we limit the number of those instruments that can be retired out of the system. But yes, it is possible.
Thank you, Jean-Yves. Now to Jane. You mentioned in your slides that industrial abatement could be expensive. And do you have any insights on how to overcome this? And I think to an extent, if I can broaden that question, what would you see the role of carbon pricing and carbon crediting in particular in relation to expensive industrial abatement? And then the other question to you would be about land-based offsets. How does Australia's current approach compare with other international standards? Is there a good way to assess the reliability of land-based offsets? So over to you, Jane.
Great, thank you. And if I can go slightly off script, just on the carbon neutrality question, it's a very live conversation for us in Australia at the moment. So we have an Australian government administered and set national carbon offset standard, follows exactly the same pattern. The idea that you eliminate, reduce, and then offset as sort of the last step. We recognize Australian carbon credit units as part of that, and also other international units such as CERs and things like that. The Clean Energy Regulator has just consulted with business on a way of bridging the gap. So we're trying to encourage voluntary action. And I think a lot of the feedback and it links into this question about why is it hard for big industry? If they're not ready to go the full step to full carbon neutrality, we're trying to bridge that gap to say, well, if you're not at net zero yet, is there information that we can actually publish to show that you're making your way, to progress towards your targets. So that's something that we're actually looking at doing at the moment. We've consulted on it, and I can post some links about our consultation paper, but we've been absolutely inundated with probably way more responses from industry about how that might look than we were expecting. So it's a watch this space. As far as why in the industrial sectors, the emissions reduction fund projects have been less successful, I think price is probably the main barrier at the moment. So in Australia, the price of an ACCU, which is our unit, sits around $15, $16 a unit. I think it peaked at just over 18. So I think at that price point, and remembering that we run an auction, a reverse auction, so with the government as the main source of demand at the moment, and our mandate is to get the lowest cost abatement, that's just not the price point that makes it worth it, I think, at the moment for large industry to undertake sort of transformative projects, because essentially the cost of installing new kit and going offline and all of that is not sufficient at the moment for the trade-off that you're getting for the unit that you'd get. And I guess there's also the question about whether people are keeping their powder dry at the moment. So if the safeguard baseline was to reduce, maybe people want to take that action at a later date. So that's on the industry question. And the other question was about, I guess, how we compare internationally. So the methods under the Emissions Reduction Fund, as much as possible, conform with UNFCCC sort of standards and reporting. So where applicable, any sort of emissions factors and calculations like that do refer back to the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme, which feeds into our national inventory reporting. So I guess from that perspective, as much as possible, we are conforming with international reporting standards. I think probably we're trying to figure out the comparison is looking at things like our risk of reversal buffers and sort of how conservative we are when discounting. And to be honest, I probably can't answer that question, but I certainly know that feedback from our stakeholders are that they think that our bar is very high. So I guess that's what we're always dealing with is, that trade-off between making it easier for people to participate versus, not wanting to compromise on the integrity of the units that we're issuing.
Excellent. And indeed, if your stakeholders, in particular project developers, are saying that the bar is high, then that's usually a good indication that it is so. Let me turn over to Carolina. Carolina, you're, in terms of the lineup that we have, you're the first coming from an emerging economy, put it this way. And in that sense, one question to you would be, how different do you think the debate has been on carbon pricing and on carbon crediting and this whole issue from an emerging economy perspective than it is, for example, from more established carbon markets and bigger bureaucracies, put it this way, around climate policy in different countries? And following up from that is, let me ask you this: if you were to ask for assistance or guidance in advice on either ask or give advice to other countries, what would it be in terms of your experience with developing the carbon crediting scheme in Chile?
Well, two really good questions, because as you say, we are an emerging economy, and we have the same question that you were saying before, like how you do this. And one thing that is on discussion right now in Chile is, for example, okay, we could consider, and we will consider, international standard, but how? Because we are talking about a domestic mechanism, how we go for projects, for example, for nature-based solution projects, because they are not as big as the one that you have in national and international standard. We don't have that many projects. We don't know how to contabilize that projects and to be transparent with that reductions, and how to improve the implementation of that projects. That is a big discussion that I think is similar probably in the region, and we don't know yet how to do it in order to have. Of course, we are going to have renewables projects and things like that. Chile was active on that on the CDM, and we have experience on that. But this kind of project that we put in our NDC, and we needed them in order to be carbon neutral, how you put this into the market and use it, because it is not just big projects. We have a lot of people that do small projects, and this is an expensive way to participate in this mechanism with international standard. How you do that combination when you promote nature-based solution with this kind of mechanism is a question that we don't have the answer yet, but we need to put something like that on our rules in order to participate with this world that is nature-based solution. We have this question, and what is also another question that I will do is how you develop the mechanism for accountability of this, but in reality, how you put it in order to don't have double counting, because we are working for this in a domestic way in order to go for our NDC goals, etc. And how you put that on your accountability is another question that, of course, we are looking for the experience of the developed countries, but we have a lot of questions on that.
Thank you, Carolina. Now on to memory, and I had one question myself for memory, but I do believe that you partially answered that. But the question being, given that South Africa is, let's say, in particular, the Republic of South Africa, a regional leader in the sub-region of Southern Africa, how would you engage eventually or when on the development of let's say, a carbon offset pool across Southern Africa? But there's a separate question that has been asked about, you talked about efficiency measures in the residential sector. That's really critical for many, many countries, both developed and developing. And it's, as we all know, a kind of a hard nut to crack. Can you give examples of these measures, and how do you track whether people are actually implementing them? So how would you benefit the people who comply with these standards? So memory, if you can.
So in terms of our energy efficiency tax incentive, in terms of building energy efficiency, there is an institute that actually works on that. They will create the baseline, and then they measure the energy efficiency savings. And once those are certified and verified, you get a certificate, and then you can utilize that and get a rebate against your income tax. But because it's a business tax incentive currently, most of the beneficiaries are the commercial sector, so to say. So that's that energy efficiency. But then in terms of households, we haven't figured it out how we're going to roll that out for households. And in terms of, I guess you asked the question about carbon neutrality. So for us, because we're doing full reliance and we're just setting it up, so last 2019, July to December was our first reporting period. So you find that we're still learning. We managed to have the offsets. I think we generated over 200 100,000 credits that were utilized for that phase of the reporting against the carbon tax liability. But going forward, we see our offset system as a way for us to create the ETS, and also in terms of the Article 6 negotiations, if we're going to have ITMOs and all as a country, it will be an expansion of the offsets. So that's why we're looking at wanting to develop it. And I think as a country that's within a power pool with other countries in the SADC, that's where we'll probably start in terms of the offsetting, like how do we get into the SADC since we share, we've got a power pool, and which projects will we allow? But since we're still starting, it's something we are looking at for the second phase, which is from 2023. So once, I guess, the system is established, we will start those kind of consultations with our neighbors, especially the ones that are in the power pool. Yeah, I think those are the questions. Thanks.
I do have one, well, a couple of questions that we could go through very quickly in succession. Maybe we can even reverse the order. One is, and I think it comes from somebody that is working very much in one of the standard bodies, and the question is: have you considered the adaptation or adoption of international standards? And I believe with South Africa that is the case, and I think with others, adopting international standards such as CDM, VCS, and others, rather than developing your own governance and infrastructure. So I'd like all of you to speak a little bit to that, just saying, have you considered and how you considered that question. The other question I think quite critical is, as you all know, we're in the process of developing, updating NDCs. There's an announcement today from the EU. Tomorrow, we're waiting for an announcement also from the US. So there's this growing momentum in terms of both NDCs and long-term trajectories. At the same time, we also have a lot of developments on the voluntary carbon market with this new task force on scaling up the voluntary market. A lot of companies claiming carbon neutrality and using offsets. Do you have any views on how your work at the national level can interface with this discussion on the voluntary carbon market, and what do you see is the ongoing role of offsets in your case, going 20, 30 years from now? So this is a tall order, but I'll ask you to be very brief in your comments to these questions from myself and from one of the participants. And we'll start in reverse order. Memory, please, if you can.
So in terms of adapting international standards for South Africa, for the AFOLU, our vegetation savanna management and all, we've adopted a number of the VCS standard, but customized it for South African grasslands and vegetation. So we have considered that, and we're in the process of looking at which other ones we can customize. And then the question on, I guess, the private sector, we look at it as a way of actually expanding the market, getting the liquidity, getting the private sector to participate in this market. So in as much as because we cover the taxpayers, the ones that are emitting, but we want to create, because it has the opportunity of creating so much jobs and all, especially in the nature, biodiversity and all. So it's something we are looking at also in terms of the green recovery from this whole COVID pandemic. How do we then get the private sector to be more involved beyond the taxpayers that we have? And it's a discussion that we are having in South Africa through the whole debate on just transition. Thanks.
Thank you, Memory. Carolina?
Well, thanks. And And as was Memory saying, yes, in Chile, I already said that we are looking for international standards and we want to customize that for the national reality. Mainly, as I was saying before, in nature-based solutions. And there we have like a big thing to work. And regarding the private sector, in Chile, the private sector is involved on this. They want the market, and what we need to do is to put on this also the co-benefits. The things that Memory was saying is really important about how you create jobs and how you help the people in the territories with this kind of mechanism is something that we want to show with this mechanism, because you don't have to see it just like in a market way. You have to see that this mechanism helps to the implementation of climate action. And on that, we have a green recovery plan that considers the investment of 30%, at least 30% of the public investment in climate action. And for example, we don't have that related with a carbon mechanism. So there we have a thing to work also in order to put these big plans in conversation, to put it hand by hand and going in parallel, but talking between each other.
As far as the international standards, and yes, where appropriate, we will incorporate that into the design of our methods. I think similar to Memory, we'll adopt them where appropriate and then change them to actually suit sort of Australia's circumstances. Even as far as Australia's size and the difficulties around measuring and things like that. So yes, certainly as much as possible, we are adopting and adhering to international standards. On the carbon neutrality and voluntary action, I think for Australia, that is the focus at the moment. We are seeing a huge sort of step change and increase in the amount of companies that are making those types of claims. We're seeing some of that on the ground, and as far as how many companies are starting to voluntarily surrender our Australian carbon units and also other international units. I think a lot of our policy settings at the moment are geared towards facilitating that. We had a review of our of our policies recently, an independent review, things like looking at facilitating an exchange traded market. These are the sorts of things that we're looking at the moment to increase, liquidity and participation in the voluntary market.
Thanks. Maybe quickly, unrelated to your question, it started snowing here. Wow. Back to your question. Yes, we are working on different offset protocol pertaining to land-based. First one on the forestry side should come this summer, and other ones will come I would say in the upcoming year. In terms of the voluntary carbon market, there is still a lot of discrepancy in terms of the level of quality of the credit that we are seeing. And we are pretty hopeful that with our design and with other countries adopting, I would say, stringent design, high quality offset credit, that we're going to influence the voluntary market. We've seen an improvement in the last few years, and we're definitely going to see more improvement in the upcoming years. And yes, talking with different businesses on this side that are looking at carbon neutrality, quality of those credits are something that is more and more looked at and considered. So very positive news here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always good to end on a positive note. Just a few closing remarks for myself, having been in this space for many years. It's quite interesting to see how the evolution of the discussion around carbon crediting and carbon offsetting in general has been. Noteworthy, and I think everyone here has spoken to that, is the increase of interest on the voluntary side, very much spurred by this idea of carbon neutrality claims, and the fact that I think over time there will have to be increased scrutiny, and we're seeing that in terms of the quality of these units. Also interesting to note is we're talking here about 4 very different realities: Australia, Chile, South Africa, Quebec, national government, subnational province, very different economic reality, etc. And somehow we're speaking the language of carbon offsetting, and we're getting ourselves understood. So it is quite a flexible instrument, and it has the potential to be adaptable to different policy situations, and that has been, I think, abundantly made clear by this the presentations that we've seen. I think now, final 2 things from myself. Just to note that Harry from the World Bank team has already put on the chat the links to the crediting guidebook that is now available in the World Bank website, as long as another link to other technical documents, such as the ones that Marisa has presented in her presentation. And I believe now we have the perhaps the possibility of looking at what the graphical illustrator has made of our discussion here. So, Riley, would you want us to show us what the illustration is?
Thank you so much, Pedro. And I'll share my screen here briefly. If you could just let me know if you can see it properly. We should be looking at the first image of 3. Fantastic. Yep. So we have 3 images from today, and these are a preliminary version that we'll finish once we are offline here, and be very happy to share after the session. And so we have a first opening remarks and the initial presentation on crediting. We have a second image here from Australia and Quebec. And then there's a following third image, and I'll just share these very briefly, but again, they will be available as well after the session. Third and final image from Chile and South Africa. And these are basically intended as a visual summary of some of what we heard today, as an additional way of looking at these core concepts, complementary to, of course, the wealth of information that's available in the document itself. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Riley. I'm always in awe of people who can do this, because quite honestly, I'm the worst note taker that I know, and I couldn't possibly follow up and still do this level of graphic proficiency in doing this type of work. So thank you very much, Riley, for that. I hope you have enjoyed this basically 1.5 hours that we've spent together. On my behalf, I think on behalf of everybody who's helped organize and put together this session, I would like to thank the speakers first of all, and obviously thank everyone who has joined in, asked questions, and generally listened in to our session. And with that, thank you, and it's goodbye from me and goodbye from all of us here. Thank you.